There are a lot of complex strategies out there when it comes to withdrawing your money in retirement. We've already gone over some of them, such as the Guyton-Klinger rule, but not all strategies have to be that complicated to work well. Sometimes the simplest strategy is the most brilliant of all. And today, that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to be talking about two of the simplest retirement spending strategies out there. We're going to discuss their pros and cons, as well as who should be using them. Let's get started. But before we get going, be sure to like this video if you haven't already, as it really does help out the channel a lot, and subscribe with notifications on for more money-related videos like this one every single week. So the strategies that we're going to be covering today are very similar to one another, in that they are both known as fixed withdrawal strategies. They are the fixed dollar withdrawal strategy and the fixed percentage withdrawal strategy. Let's start with the simpler of the two, the fixed dollar withdrawal strategy. The fixed dollar withdrawal strategy is exactly what it sounds like. You begin by withdrawing a certain dollar amount from your nest egg every single month and keep that amount constant throughout your entire retirement. It literally doesn't get any simpler than that. Say if John were living on this strategy in retirement. He has a $1 million nest egg and wants to be able to live on $40,000 a year. He withdraws $40,000 in that first year of retirement, does the same thing in the second, and so on and so forth. In other words, there are no adjustments for inflation using this method. To analyze this strategy, let's look at the four factors of retirement, which for those who are new to this channel are income, risk, stability, and buying power. Income measures how much money is coming in the door each month, as well as when that money is coming in. It's measured this way because not all retirement spending strategies are systematic and linear with their income growth. And none of us know how long we're going to be in retirement, so we tend to put more of a priority in having abnormally high income years in the earliest portion of our retirements, since we don't know if we'll ever get to the later portions. Risk is the likelihood of outliving your money. Stability is graded by how often you experience anything that would be considered an undesirable change in your income from one year to another. This could come in the form of a freeze on the growth of your income, or just a decline in your income from one year to the next. And buying power is defined like it always is. It's a measure of how much your money can actually get you at any given time, and is largely tied to inflation. The fixed dollar strategy is generally considered to be a little stronger on income and risk in comparison to other popular strategies like the 4% rule, but it does suffer in terms of stability and buying power. The reason for this is simple. As long as your initial withdrawals aren't too high, you're relatively unlikely to outlive your money using this strategy. And you may actually be able to live at a higher standard of living, at least initially, than you would have in other similar strategies like the 4% rule. In fact, going all the way back to 1950, if John had had that $1 million nest egg invested in something like the S&P 500, he would not actually outlive his money during any 20, 30, 40, or 50-year retirement, as long as he withdrew no more than $54,000 a year or $4,500 a month. So even things like the housing crisis and dot-com crash didn't cause him to run out of money. So this does grant John a higher standard of living initially than the 4% rule would have, because of course with a $1 million nest egg, the 4% rule would only allow him to draw $40,000 a year to live on. Though eventually, like I said, the inflation effect would catch up with him using the fixed dollar approach. And that's where this strategy does tend to fall short. It's not meant for longer retirements. Because while John may be able to handle living on $54,000 a year, particularly if he's retiring debt-free with a paid-off home, it becomes increasingly difficult to do that as the years go on due to the inflation effect. Historically speaking, inflation has averaged somewhere between 2 and 3% per year in the United States. If we assume that our personal average inflation rate in retirement is nearer the top of that scale at 3% per year, then John's $54,000 a year income will get him the equivalent of what $40,000 would buy him today in just 10 years' time. In 20 years, his money would only be able to buy him about what $29,900 would buy him today, and his money would be worth the equivalent of $22,250, $16,550, and $12,300 a year in 30, 40, and 50 years respectively, just because of the effect of inflation. So just for a minute, let's imagine that John had decided to follow the financially independent, retire early movement. But instead of using the 4% rule, which helps to protect your buying power over longer-term retirements like those in the FIRE community are aiming for, John decides to use the fixed dollar withdrawal method. Assuming everything else stayed the same, John would retire at the age of 30 with a $54,000 a year income and a $1 million nest egg. Again, at the age of 30, that would be perfectly fine for him. However, the average life expectancy for people living in the US is about 79 years old as of 2019. And it's possible that that number will continue to grow as technology and medicine continues to advance. So assuming he doesn't die young, it isn't out of the question that he would have a near 50-year retirement and be living on the equivalent of about $1,000 a month when he's aging and his medical costs are at their highest. As you can imagine, that wouldn't be an ideal situation for John, and that's why this strategy generally isn't the best idea for longer-term retirements. But for the right person, in terms of the 4 factors of retirement, the fixed dollar strategy is above average in income and risk, but below average in stability and buying power, in comparison to the 4% rule. The fixed percentage method works very similarly to the fixed dollar method, except that you're withdrawing a certain percentage of your nest egg every year, as opposed to a certain dollar value. This strategy also doesn't adjust for inflation, but it does at least adjust with the value of your portfolio. And depending on what you're invested in and what initial percentages you choose, this method may work out alright. Say John just wanted to withdraw 4% of his investments each year in retirement. Since the value of his investments were $1 million when he retired, he would withdraw $40,000 in his first year. That would leave him with $960,000 left over. If his investments went up by 10% that year, the value of his portfolio would be somewhere in the neighborhood of $1,056,000 at the start of his second year of retirement. Since he's withdrawing 4% of that, he would live on $42,240 in that second year. Assuming inflation was 3% during that first year of his retirement, his buying power would have actually gone up. If he had merely adjusted his withdrawals for inflation, like he would have if he were using the actual 4% rule, he would have withdrawn $41,200 in his second year, or about $1,040 less than he did using the fixed percentage withdrawal method in this scenario. The downside that I'm sure a lot of you already see is that the reverse can also happen. Say that the following year John's investments fell by 20%, bringing the value of his nest egg down to about $811,000 and forcing him to withdraw $32,440 in the third year of his retirement. That would be significantly less than the $42,400 that John would have withdrew in that third year using the actual 4% rule. So as you can see, depending on the situation, stability is something that this strategy could have a very low score in, given that the value of a nest egg, especially if it's invested in something like stocks, can grow or shrink by 20, 30, or even 40% from one year to the next. The bright side, of course, is that you have a very low risk of running out of money. Theoretically, it's actually zero if you're able to follow this strategy to a T. And I specifically say theoretically because, like many things, it's only going to be true up to a certain point. If we take it to a logical extreme, we can break this down. Say if John had $10,000 in his nest egg and he wanted to live on 50% of that nest egg for the next 5 years. In theory, he'd be fine and he'd never run out of money because he'd always be withdrawing 50% of whatever that nest egg is. But how many of us are going to be able to live on $5,000 a year? That would be what he'd be withdrawing that first year. And of course, it would be even less the second year. If his investments stayed flat, his second year's withdrawals would be half of $5,000, or $2,500. And I don't know many people that are living on $200 a month. But the point is, if you're willing to take the hit to the stability of your income in retirement, you can usually safely squeeze out a little more than 4% of your nest egg each year in a typical retirement using this strategy. You just have to be prepared to see the average raw dollar income that you receive shrink as you go further into your retirement. To illustrate this, let's say that John withdrew 10% of his nest egg each year. Assuming he had that $1 million nest egg, he would start out with a 6-figure income. However, if he ended up living longer than he planned on, he could eventually find himself living on what would only be generously described as a shoestring budget. For example, in the simulations I ran covering the various retirement lengths starting from 1950 onward, assuming John had invested in the S&P 500, he would have had a median monthly income of about $6,500 a month in 20 and 30-year retirements, which, when adjusting for inflation, would be about $3,600 a month in 20-year scenarios and $2,700 a month in 30-year scenarios. But that number did shrink a lot as the retirements got longer. For example, in 50-year retirements, his average median monthly income was about $4,400, which again doesn't sound bad, but when we look at the final few years' worth of his monthly withdrawals, we find that it's actually about $2,300 a month on average, which is considerably less than the six-figure income he started with. And of course, that $2,300 a month was what he was actually withdrawing almost 50 years from now. Once we adjust for inflation over that time, it may not even buy John what $1,000 a month would buy him today. So similar to the fixed dollar withdrawals, your buying power could be taking a significant hit if the initial percentages you set in this strategy are too high. In summation, the fixed percentage method scores reasonably well, though not elite when it comes to income, particularly when used in early retirements. It does great in terms of risk, again assuming you're not too aggressive with your initial percentages, but is questionable with stability and below average in terms of buying power. So in the end, who should use these strategies? Now I'll admit, I am personally biased here. I believe there's very few people who should realistically be using these strategies as their primary method. It's mainly limited to those with very short expected retirements, so that their buying power doesn't become too damaged over time. And even then, ideally only by those who are also approaching that same retirement with little to no debt, because especially with the fixed percentage method, you'll often need to be pretty flexible with your spending from year to year. But for those who aren't retiring early, and will have no more than 9 or 10 years that they expect to be retired, they have little debt to speak of, and want something very simple to follow when figuring out how much of their money they should withdraw each year, one of these strategies could work out well. It gives you some advantages in terms of income without significant increases in risk. But what are your thoughts? Do you agree with my assessment of the strategy, or do you think that I'm missing something? Do you think another strategy would work better for people in that situation? Let me know in the comments section below. But that'll do it for me today. Once again, if you haven't already, be sure to like the video as it really helps the channel out a lot. And if you want to learn more about various retirement planning strategies, be sure to check the links on the screen for my videos on how to safely spend money in retirement as well as protect your nest egg. And as always, thanks for watching.